loneliness, eccentricity, and individuality in photograph 51 and my brilliant career. Again, we start with our overarching questions. What causes people to be isolated? Well, society, the structural way society is. If we look at their influences around them, the way people treat them could cause someone to become isolated. The way they feel about other people and their reactions to them could cause them to become more isolated. Poverty could be a cause of isolation. Being financially different could cause you to either retreat or others for you to treat you differently. Intellect. Certainly the characters in our text are isolated due to their intelligence. There are many things that you can look at in terms of these two texts about why people can become isolated. Particularly in My Brilliant Career, you may also want to talk about the setting. The really harsh rural Australian climate can cause people to become isolated. And what does it mean to be eccentric? Different? More than different? Unique? Someone who breaks the mold and challenges and goes after something new or different that's against the times. Those people could be viewed as eccentric. Some of the best creators of our times are seen to be a little bit mad. And maybe we can see that in Rosalind and we can see that in Sibylla. But lastly, what does it also mean to be an individual? To have individual desires, individual hopes and dreams, to challenge the status quo, to break away from your family. Again, to do something new. To stand up for yourself when others are telling you to step back into line. To conform, or the opposite of conforming. You know, they're telling you to conform and you're saying, no, I'm going to be my true, authentic self. These are the types of things you will need to break down to come up with topic sentences for exam style questions on these topics. So this slide just goes through the key elements that could be related to isolation, loneliness, eccentricity, or individuality. So the kind of factors that you need to look at. As we said first up, society, social conventions. So you might want to highlight that with your highlighter. Societies present rules and expectations that individuals are expected to conform to. These are informed by things like gender stereotypes. Individuals who do not adhere to these social rules are considered a bit eccentric, a bit different, outsiders. And this is certainly the experience of many characters in both of these texts. You obviously have Sibylla and Rosalind who are outsiders due to their gender, but you can also look at this through the lens of class and race. If you look at the character of Frank Howden, due to his ethnicity as an Aboriginal Australian, he is a bit more of an outcast. You can also look at class and structure in terms of Gosling in photograph 51. Because he is sub-junior in his academic learning, he is seen as just the lowly assistant. But you can say, okay, well, these things are completely different in terms of race and class, but that's still okay because we're still talking about similarities and differences in the text. Coming back to our key themes of isolation, loneliness, eccentricity, and individuality, we can again link this back to our previous learning about the role of women. Gender and the accompanying expectations prove to be a barrier, particularly for the protagonists of both texts in achieving their goals and earning the respect of their respective societies. We know that in particular, Rosalind delves deeper and deeper into her own isolation as the text continues. And that's because of the way she's marginalised as a woman. She's excluded from the common room. There are comments made about her behind her back. The fact that she's treated poorly upon her arrival and being told, oh, well, the situation's changed. And the way Wilkins betrays her initially by crediting her work as kind of the team's work forces her further and further away from her colleagues. We also see Sybilla's isolation as a woman. We don't really see Sybylla with any friends. We see her stepping further and further away from her family because of their poverty and then that clashing with her ambition. The way that she's sent to the MSWATs as a type of almost exile, further and further away from her goals, further and further into isolation. Another key factor you might also like to look at is the refusal to compromise. So the protagonists refuse to compromise their beliefs and to collaborate with others, which leads to their isolation. Their strength of character is a quality that is respected by us, the contemporary reader, but it's not valued by the other people in the text. So because of their very polarizing, bold personalities, very opinionated, it does prevent others from getting to know them or getting too close to them. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, we can debate later, but it is something that leads to their loneliness. They do not have really close, loving relationships with other characters. It kind of links into the final element there of being a pioneer. So these texts in particular depict women who can be considered pioneers. They have a desire to succeed in their roles that were not traditionally occupied by women. So because they are different, they're kind of the first of their kind, that can really struggle to help them socially. They are essentially outcasts in the text because they are so different. We've just given you some dot points about evidence that you may wish to use when looking at each of these themes. So ideas explored in the text that relate to isolation and loneliness. You could talk about Sybilla's initial move to Possum Gully, or you might want to add to that Barney's Gap as well, where she moves with the MSWATs. And then through this, you could talk about the setting. So moving to a new place or moving to a new setting can lead to loneliness and isolation. And we see this with Rosalind as well. At the start of the text, she moves from Paris to London. That's an isolating move in itself. How she's treated upon her arrival and how she's moved from one setting to another can be something that you sit there and look at. So on your notes, I would definitely be circling the word setting as something that you don't forget. The settings are a key structural feature that really promote isolation and loneliness in the text. What is different about setting, though, is Rosalind's ability to choose. Rosalind chooses to come to King's College, although she feels at some stages that was under false pretenses. Rosalind's ability to make choices about her change of setting, about whether she stays or goes, etc., is completely different to Sibylla, who has no choice. Due to the hierarchical nature of her family moves to Possum Gully, she moves to Possum Gully. Her mum tells her she's going to Barney's Gap, she's going to Barney's Gap. And so there you can kind of talk about free choice in relation to moving and setting as well. What else can be really lonely in these texts and that you could use as an example is charting a new path. So being the first of your kind can be isolating and lonely. Can be exciting, but isolating. Both women are pioneers in their academic fields. They seek to work in fields that are not commonly occupied by women. And that means that they don't have female colleagues around them. They are breaking new ground. They're being challenged by the people around them, which again can lead to those kinds of feelings where you are alone. What is different though is that Rosalind is successful in her field. She's robbed of credit and the respect that she deserves, yes. But Sibylla, despite her talent and ambition and wanting to be this blazing woman of poetry, her passions are limited because of the Australian setting, because of opportunities available to female Australian poets. Again, because of her family. Everard Gray wanted to take her out on the stage. Granted, that's not poetry, but it was still in the arts, and her granny says no. So again, it's Rosalind's ability to be a little bit more successful than Sibylla that you can start looking at as a contrast. And again, you might want to mention is because of the differing historical context. Sibylla's text is set a good 50 years before Rosalind's. So you can always argue things are improving for women. Are they ideal? No. But there are some senses of freedom that Rosalind has that Sibylla, 50 years in the past, just simply didn't have. Yep. I don't think they were particularly poor. I think that she had access to a good education, so that would put them in a probably middle class area. What about a refusal to compromise? How can this be isolating and lonely? Sibylla refuses to compromise on her values and on her dreams. As such, she continuously rejects the marriage proposals. Because she won't compromise her beliefs, it leads her to a life without a partner and family that we obviously assume. That can be lonely. It can be isolating. Again, it's her choice, and the reasons that she's chosen that are obviously complex, but nonetheless, because she refuses to compromise, she's isolated in that way. We then have Rosalind in a different sense, who just will not collaborate with her fellow colleagues. Again, the reasons behind that are complex. Because of the way they've treated her, she refuses to then collaborate with them. There is systemic sexism that Rosalind faces. It's personified by Watson and the way that he pursues her work, the way he taunts her in her own lab, but also by Wilkins on a lesser scale, which then leads to her not wanting to work with these men. And as we said earlier, going further and further into isolation. We could argue when we're looking at compromising, what Rosalind faces is a lot more overt. There are clear examples of sexism happening in the text, or in relation to her Jewishness as well, which are very obvious examples of her being excluded because of those factors that lead to her not willing to compromise and work with the team. Sibylla's are much more subtle. It's just these big overarching expectations that young women get married and have families. No one ever kind of points the finger at her and says, you must go and get married right now. You're way too old. But the way she has that internal dialogue explaining her choices is really important there. We've also included for you a sample paragraph on isolation and loneliness. So you can go through this at your own pace later on, because we will be setting an essay topic for homework, not to write the whole essay, but to at least do a plan. And this will kind of be our focus. So use this to inspire you as you work through that later on the weekend. So let's keep going with some of our comparisons. What about eccentricity in the text? Being a little different and a bit wild. So rejection of society's strict social conventions causes the characters to be viewed as a bit eccentric, a bit odd. Now, these are really stuffy old societies, and you can probably see that through the way they construct limits on women, gender, class, what they dress, how they dress, the way they speak to each other. All of that is clear in setting up these worlds of the text where it's very strict. And obviously, if you're kind of going against that, you're going to be this weird kind of eccentric outcast. So Sibylla is criticised for her immodest and bold behaviour, saying that she should have been a boy. On quite a few events, there's been comments about Sibylla not being womanly enough. One incident that you may wish to note down is where she leaves Frank Horden at the gate and drives off on him or rides off on him. And later when she comes back, he says about her being such a tomboy. So that could be an example of behaviour that Sibylla exhibits that's not seen as that mild, meek, womanly behaviour that they expected at the time. Again, you have Rosalind not conforming to the way that women were portrayed at the time, and the way she was characterised as icy and cold. These are written in the stage directions, so you would like to refer to them as stage directions rather than use them as quotes. It portrays a perception that women who do not fit the maternal stereotype are kind of outcasts and are seen as, you know, just these strange creatures. Even the fact where Rosalind, as a secondary example, rejects Wilkins' chocolates. He was a bit like, aren't women supposed to like chocolates is kind of the mentality. He doesn't see what he's doing is wrong. But again, because Rosalind is portrayed as icy and cold, she's portrayed as the other or different. We also have these characters showing a lot of individuality, which again kind of links into eccentricity, but they have a desire to be different, to be independent. For example, you could come back to Sibylla, her rejection of marriage in order to maintain her independence and control over her fate. Somewhat limited, obviously, still by her family, who seem to be in control of her, and we could probably argue that's why she's never successful. And then we have Rosalind, who prefers to work alone. She knows she is more meticulous than her male counterparts because of her mentality over you must never be wrong. And that she's there to prove the science. She doesn't hypothesize or build models. She really wants to work on her own and to do it her way. Further to this, you could look at the protagonist's desire for independence and how that mirrors the movements of their societies. So now you're getting into more complex ideas. So you want to try to push yourself to go deeper and deeper into the text. using not just the physical setting, but the social setting as well. So that helps you to make that definition between the physical setting, so rough rural Australia, posh inner city London college, but also the social setting, the way the society is constructed in the text, the patriarchal, hierarchical nature, the importance of families in Australia versus what was happening in the UK is a slightly more modern version. So Sibylla, her reflection, her text comes on the precipice of Australia's independence. So at the time that this text was published, Australia too were fighting for their own freedoms. It was around the time we became a federation. We were no longer just a colony of England. We actually became our own country. And you can kind of see that fight for independence and becoming our own country as Sibylla's fight to become her own person. So you can look at the way that's being mirrored. You could also use as a secondary example Frank Hawden there. If you want to make references to his Aboriginality, the way that he is treated because of that is really important to what Australia was like at the time, what the views and values of the writer were at the time, the views and values of that society. Again, his struggle and his lack of acceptance is central to the societal views and values at the time. Then we have Rosalind. Rosalind's achievements precede movements towards gender equality. Even though she's better off than Sibylla, she's still limited. It wasn't really until the 60s and the 70s that the huge women's movements came through. So we can see Rosalind's contributions to science are only recognised after her death. So everybody else got the glory, and it wasn't until many years later when these feminist movements did come through that Rosalind is given the recognition that she deserves. So again, we can see that being a sign of the times in the UK. Almost there. Holding values that are inconsistent with their societies renders both protagonists outsiders, but they also find allies. So if your values are different, you're going to be an outsider. You can obviously talk about Rosalind. She's revered and respected by Caspar, who models the treatment that she should be entitled to in order to accentuate the treatment she receives. So Don Caspar's different. So you don't want to talk about Rosalind and Sibylla all the time. Who else can I talk about? Don Caspar. He's come from the US. He's treating Rosalind completely different. And so as such, you can offer him up as a contrast. He doesn't seem to fit in with the others either. Again, as another outsider, you might want to talk about Gosling. He and Rosalind have a much better relationship because he too is an outsider, because he hasn't finished his studies and credentials to be a senior scientist. So again, these different people who are outsiders. So in photograph 51, you've got Rosalind, you've got Don Caspar to talk about, and you have Gosling to talk about. And then you have In My Brilliant Career looking at outsiders. Yes, Sibylla, we've talked about eccentric Sibylla, but what about Aunt Helen? She's neither a wife, a widow, nor a maid. And as such, she's rendered as an outsider in her society. She's beautiful. She's done everything right. Why is she an outsider? Well, she got divorced. Her husband was unfaithful. But yet she is the one who is the outsider because that was how women were viewed. That's how divorce was viewed. She goes straight home to her mother once she is divorced, back to the family, either the property of the husband or the property of the family. And as such, now that she's not a wife, or perhaps it would have been better for her to be widowed, She then loses her her status and goes back to the outsider. No one will touch her now. Other examples that you can look at in my brilliant career in terms of outsiders, we've said Frank Horden is a great example that you should be using. You could look at the M-SWATs as this weird microcosm of people who are really wealthy but are looked down upon. They live on this little isolated property. They look disgusting. People gossip about them in town and no one really wants to work there. So again, that idea of classism coming through. That's where we're going to pause today. The remaining slides have a few more comments about differences and textual evidence that you can just use for reference. But we will be going on with looking at how to unpack an essay topic.